Okay, hello and welcome to another edition of the Impact Narrative, and this is a slightly different edition. We've always wanted to have special guest stars, and we have the very fortunate situation this time that Simon Mabon isn't here. I've been looking forward to this moment for a very long time. I'm very delighted that we have here as Simon's substitute Dr. Sophia Al-Khalad, and one of the great things about being at Lancaster with its rising international reputation is that one meets people from all parts of the world and distant places that we've never visited, we've heard about. And in Sophie's case, I believe that you're actually from the management school, which some of us know about. We've heard rumours, stories about it, and it'd be interesting to know how people exist in this fabled place. But maybe that's for another time. The main thing is to say how delighted we are that Sophie has agreed, because Sophie has got expertise in areas which are topical for rather unfortunate reasons. She's a Manchester United supporter. But also the main thing we're going to talk about is something I was going to start by saying we try to discuss Syria, but the media doesn't seem to want to discuss it, and this is the very day when Syria is once again regrettably at the top of the media agenda. But first of all, Sophie, the main thing is your expertise makes you not only somebody who is a very interesting academic in the field of entrepreneurship, which is your chosen field, but in some ways you're kind of more suitable to be teaching in the a PPR department and teaching politics than to be teaching anything else, or in fact you're more suited to it than any of us, because your interests are really at the forefront of practical, interesting, topical, crucial issues. So
I wouldn't say that. I haven't studied politics. I'm not theoretically engaged with political theory. It's just something that I draw upon in my research, which I've had to do.
But anyone doing any research about anything that human beings do is basically doing. I'll put you right on that one. Politics is the master subject, which infuses absolutely everything else. But your research is, the main area of research is on refugees. And obviously the situation in Syria has lent itself to, and in fact is the main focus, I guess, of your research. Yeah. So what exactly, this is a country whose population is largely displaced, and I wonder if you could just very briefly, perhaps, whatever time you want to take on it, just explain your research. And obviously your own background has inspired the research, at least in part. But you're obviously researching into, in particular, the plight of women as refugees.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I've got some personal connection to the study. I'm actually half Syrian myself. My dad is from Syria and my mum's British. I was born in Syria and lived there for 7 years, and then actually lived in Saudi Arabia after that for a while, and then came back to the UK. My research, my PhD research, was actually looking at women's entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia as a means of emancipation and political empowerment, actually. And that was before the Syrian revolution took place. And so when that happened, 2011, 2012, started to see obviously a large amount of people being displaced, and a lot of families destroyed in a way, and started to read just bits and pieces in the media and with the UNHCR and UNICEF and so on, started to see how women were engaging with entrepreneurship in a very different way than what we're used to, especially in the western part of the world, and they were using it as an absolute means of survival, means to feed their children, and that's for various reasons, which we can come to in a minute. But today, as of today, 1 in 2 Syrian people are either dead or displaced or detained. There are 11 million people, I believe, that are displaced within Syria. There are around 5 million people, or Syrian people, in neighbouring Jordan, Iraq even, Turkey and Lebanon. And obviously we know that hundreds of thousands in late 2015 migrated across to Greece and Germany and Europe and the Netherlands, and the UK is bringing in 20,000 over a 5-year period. So it's a very difficult and very distressing time for everybody, Syrian people and the neighbouring countries that are really have a huge task on their hands, because 1 in 4 people in Lebanon now are Syrian, 1 in 7 people in Jordan are Syrian. So it's a lot of pressure on these countries to be able to provide employment. So there's a massive dependence on UN aid and very, very limited employment. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of women have been forced into entrepreneurship. But it's not the glamorous entrepreneurship that we know about and talk about in our media. It's not, you know, the next Richard Branson and the next Anita Roddick. You know, it's absolute survival, making very basic things and trying to sell them.
It's interesting because the whole concept of entrepreneurship as it's sold to us in the West is about aspiration and bettering oneself. This is about survival, isn't it? So it's a very different side to the whole concept of entrepreneurship. And one of the things, it just strikes me that, I mean, would you say in your judgment, because obviously what we're saying in this show is our own opinion, well, at least we have to say that the university isn't bound by anything we say. In fact, we're not, because we could say something else as soon as we leave we might just be saying things for the sake of it. Certainly Simon and I do. But in this particular case, the likelihood of these people ever finding a home or wanting to find a home in Syria is quite remote, isn't it? So that what we've got here is almost like the Palestinian problem. We've got perhaps a permanent refugee situation. Are these people who've been displaced, by because they're being earmarked as being hostile in some way to one side or another, and therefore returning to Syria in any circumstance, foreseeable circumstance, is going to be potentially hazardous for them?
I can see what you're saying. There are some similarities to the Palestinians, but no, it's not the same. I think the Palestinian situation is very different, and that's probably something for another day. But they can't go back, you know. So the reason why the Syrians can't go back is probably they don't have homes. There's no opportunity for jobs. They might be targeted because of some form of belief that they've been politically engaged. So no, the two are very different situations. But definitely it's very, very difficult for the Syrians to go back at the state.
Well, certainly in the moment, but yes, I mean, obviously it just seems, and the current situation is the reason why Syria's come back into the headlines is that a particular area near Damascus is being targeted, and civilians are caught in this deliberately or otherwise. The reports coming out of there are obviously scarce, and is that something that generally you would say is being a reason why Syria has been able to fall out of the headlines so often, that the West's focus on Syria is sporadic because there's no reporters on the ground in Syria? Whereas, and here we're now relying on eyewitness reports, and one of those reports seems to suggest that the aid isn't getting through. And I just, throughout this crisis, I've wondered how on earth the people on the ground in places like your birthplace, Homs, how on earth people are surviving at all.
I mean, it's very, very, very difficult. There are absolutely no more words left to describe what the situation is like. But somehow people are getting together and getting by. There's also seems to be areas that go through a very difficult time, whilst the neighbouring area have a small amount of time where they have a bit of a breather. But that's the issue that's happening with the internal displacement. So even family members of mine have moved around within Syria during different times. to be able to survive. But of course, the times when the tanks and so on are surrounding the cities and there's constant bombardment and there's no means of getting in or out, then in those situations people aren't really surviving.
Mm. Yes, quite unthinkable. And I mean, in terms of obviously this is an area where the government is the main actor. In other parts of Syria at the same time, we have potential standoffs between the rival powers. I mean, this is one of the things about Syria, I guess, that for people in the West, even before the conflict started, people in the West didn't really know very much about Syria.
No. And even when it did start, it was only when they started to come onto our European shores that people became really concerned. And it's because it was far away before. It was something that was happening there, in that part of the world where there's always fighting going on. And it was only until they started to come onto our shores that we started to realise the gravity of the situation.
And so, obviously, leaving at the age of 7, my partner, in fact, lived in Sri Lanka till she was 6, and she doesn't remember anything at all. She was brought up learning to speak Tamil, and now she doesn't remember a single word of it. And I wonder, is that the same, or do you have any actual memories?
No, absolutely not. I go back. I used to go back all the time.
Ah, yes. So you kind of.
Yeah, I have family there, and we used to go back every summer. We used to go back in Ramadan. And for Eid, which is, the very important Muslim celebration. And I very much identify with being Syrian. I am fluent in Arabic. I lived in Saudi Arabia, which is very close and obviously speaks the same language. So no, I never felt like I left permanently. I always identified with being half Syrian. I'm also very proud of my British roots and proud of my mum and who she is as well. I think sometimes we emphasise too much on the paternal side, but I'm very proud to be British as well.
But I mean, you said the points of comparison that you can offer are amazing. I mean, would you say, my impression would be that under a regime which you might define as being authoritarian, even in the past, that Syria was maybe one country in the Middle East which was perhaps westernised, even though obviously it had strong links with the Soviet Union, with Russia, but that it was a society which was recognisably a bit more like Britain, maybe, in some respects, than a country like Saudi Arabia. Would you say that was the reason? Because obviously I'm ignorant, and it'd be interesting to...
I think it depends on what you define or how you conceptualise westernised. I think I don't really feel very comfortable with that concept.
Right.
I would say if you wanted to look at Saudi Arabia, you could say it's more westernised in terms of its infrastructure. If you drive around Saudi Arabia, a country that has only really sort of built itself up infrastructure-wise in the last 70 years or so, then or even less. If you look at the buildings and you look at the roads and you look at the hospitals and you look at the schools, then it looks like any American city. So, I mean, from that perspective, you could say it looks more westernised. I wouldn't say Syria was like that. I think it's it has a very deep, rich history. Damascus is the oldest capital in the world, and it's not an oil-rich country like Saudi Arabia. And the intellectual knowledge that came out of Syria is something that we still use today. But if you mean in terms of ideas and the way of life, then I would say that they do have a more. They have different religions in Syria, for decades everybody has got on and just got on with it. I remember in Homs, my grandma lived on a street where the church and a mosque were opposite each other on the same street, and the church bells used to ring on Sunday, and the mosque used to call to prayer, and there was absolutely no problem. Muslims had Christmas trees, and it was. So from that perspective, I would say no, they weren't Western. They were more liberal, less conservative, and incredibly open-minded and accepting to other ways of living.
And the status of women, perhaps, is there any similarity or contrast with Saudi Arabia before the Troubles? began, would you say that a woman in Syria had more civil rights perhaps than...
Yes, legally, I think we would say that Syria gave women a bit more than what Saudi Arabia does. I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia only very recently has announced that it will allow women to drive. Only in 2015 was the first time that women were able to vote, and even then it was very limited with what they could do. But you know, we're really comparing apples and oranges here. I mean, and you know, Syria it's not a democracy, it never was, you know. So I find it very difficult to, and you know, Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, so it's very difficult to compare those contexts. But no, women weren't confined to certain guardianship rules that women in Saudi Arabia have to put up with. But sadly, until today, Syrian women are not able to give their children the nationality if the father isn't Syrian, and that's also the case in Saudi Arabia and much of the Middle East. It is changing. I believe Egypt has changed now. I think Lebanon's on its way. I think Tunisia might be on its way. But so that's also something.
And obviously then in terms of worship, the mosques are segregated in both countries. I mean, I suppose this shows why I do politics and you do entrepreneurship, because I'm always trying to get some kind of comparison to get focus on these things. But would that be the same in Syria as well as Saudi Arabia, that women, in terms of a mosque, they're excluded from the main...
I wouldn't use the word excluded, but you worship in different sections, but you are not excluded. I wouldn't say from the mosque, no.
And I mean, in a way, what may be a legacy of this. I mean, again, I'm extrapolating wildly from the things you're saying, but it may almost be that possibly that some kind of social revolution may be an unintended byproduct of this, but because if women are becoming essential to the survival of a family and they've lost their partner, or you know, they're displaced from their partner, then surely, do you think that this is possible that this will have a knock-on effect on the status of women in the area in general, that people will be perhaps regarding women at the end of this in a different light because they've been forced in a way to throw off their shackles, you might say, in a way which nobody would have wanted?
I think there's definitely going to be a change in gender relations, but I don't think that this is something that's specific to Syria. This happened after the Second World War in the UK. You know, women took on all the jobs and the men went to fight in the war, and when they came back they wanted their jobs back, and women were saying, actually, I think I don't want to be in the kitchen.
Well, they did, but then of course the men made sure that the women did go back into the kitchen, and it's only really in the 1980s, and of course, as we know, it's been part-time work and all that, so that's a revolution that hasn't happened, whereas I don't know, maybe in this case it's so dramatic, the gender change, that there'll have to be a real reassessment, whereas I think with the Second World War it was a case of, you know, the men were going off to do a job, you know, and it just happened to take precedence over the job that they had at home, but that it was always supposed to be, well, they were supposed to be home by Christmas. Well, that was the First World War, but whereas this is something I think more kind of, you know, that for a start, the gender balance is going to be so different, I guess, although killing has been indiscriminate, hasn't it, in Syria? But
absolutely, but there are a lot of the families that I've been engaging with in Jordan, so I've been going out to Jordan since 2015 and meeting with Syrian refugee families there. Some of them, the husband is has been killed or detained, or some of them, the husband is sat in a wheelchair in the corner of the room and isn't able to work. So there's definitely, I can see the change in gender relations within the household, and I think that there has been, sometimes a change only happens when you're forced into it, and a lot of these women that I've been interviewing, and obviously I haven't interviewed hundreds of thousands, or just a few women, but when I talk to them, the ones who their husbands are around are really at peace with what's happening, or they feel guilty that they've put their wife in this situation where she's struggling so much. But there's definitely there's been a change in terms of in the domestic domain as well. So a lot of the women were explaining to me that, oh, you know, for the first time my husband's actually engaging in a lot of housework because he knows I'm sat in the corner making these bracelets or making these scarves, and he knows that I'm actually going to go to the bazaar this afternoon and try and sell these things in the mosque or the bazaars that they set up for refugees, and he's going to take care of the kids at home, and that's just become the new norm. It's not something, and it's interesting because when I ask them about it, it's not something that they have discussed, and it's not something that the man resents. They've just understood that, okay, we need to change things around, and you know, hopefully this is something that will continue when they go home, which everybody is hoping for, but we'll have to see. I think it'd be great if we saw more political engagement from women, but we have to be realistic as well, that we have a 7-year gap where our younger generations haven't gone to school and haven't gone to university. So it might be the sad case of the ones who go back to try and build the country have this gap, or it might have to be that Syrians who grew up abroad and were educated will have to go in. We'll have to see what happens. For now, we all just want the endless bombing and shelling to end from both sides.
I mean, yeah, but the horrible prospect is that the political participation for all is going to be even less after the conflict than it was before, depending on the type of settlement we have. So, and you, PhD isn't yet published, but I think it really ought to be, and you're continuing to conduct this research, I mean, which is kind of linked to your PhD, but you're almost in a position to keep updating it.
Yes, I am, and the case in Saudi Arabia is very interesting because I finished my PhD in 2013 and I've been approached to make it into a book. But it's not going to be that easy because a lot has happened politically since 2013, and it'd be great to, I'm going back to the women now and following up with them and seeing, you know, some of the boundaries that they discussed in setting up their businesses were around, well, I'm unable to drive, or I'm unable to travel without, you know, my husband or my father didn't allow me to travel, and now these things
Done
are,
that again.
I
always do that every episode.
You need to have a good breakfast.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
So these, it'd be great to follow up with these women and see if indeed things have evolved and changed. I mean, the laws have just changed right now for driving. They're not even driving yet, but that's an exciting part of my research. I'm really engaging in something that honestly changes from one month to the next. So I'll just have to keep up with it. Yeah,
well, it's not insuperable. I mean, there's always an opportunity to make a cut-off date and say that this research was conducted during a process of change which has to come to an end. However, it's aiming at a moving target, a bit like British politics, which of course is Simon usually asks me questions and I burble on incessantly about it, and at the moment there are developments in British politics which are so wearingly predictable that it's obviously far more valuable to talk about Syria. And well, let's just hope. I mean, it does seem that things, whenever it surges into the media spotlight, it's for the worst of all reasons, and this particular episode, it does seem that the UN is, just going to say how terrible it is and wring their hands and stand back.
And even when you read comments from UNICEF or from Save the Children, I just read some of their comments this morning, and the comments were there are no more words left to use, which is terrible.
And this is at a time when aid agencies themselves are under the spotlight.
Yes.
And Save the Children.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is obviously an evolving situation, and we said last time that I think a lot of this is because of the sharp contrast between the purported ideals or aims of these organisations and some of the things that they really get up to. But this is, in a way, the kind of situation in Syria where suddenly any doubts about the aid organisation are going to be obscured by the necessity that, and it's kind of one of these things where the absence of an aid agency reminds us just how important these organisations are potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with watching what's happening with Oxfam and now Save the Children, it reminds us all that human beings are human beings, and regardless of your upbringing or your nature or your background or your opportunities that you've been given in life and what you've and the job that you go into, if there's an opportunity for exploitation, people, rotten people are everywhere, and unfortunately they will take it. And that's what's happened here. What is very sad as well is that it's a group of rotten people, as I would call them, but I think the aid agencies made a mistake by letting a lot of them get away with it. And now they're saying, oh, we can't keep track of where they've gone, and we can't keep track of what agencies they're with now, and I just think, goodness, if we can find Bin Laden, I think we can find people who've been accused of these things and then somehow disappeared, and we can't track them. I find that very difficult to believe.
Yeah, I mean, you would almost say that if the world was a better place, there wouldn't be a need for the aid organisations, but because the world is a terrible place, it's not in the end all that surprising that some of these things.
And it's another sad day for women, really. I think that part of it is that what they did wasn't, there isn't this massive investigation that's going into it, into finding these men who've done that and hold them to it, because maybe it's not such a massive issue as other issues that are going on out there. Always women end up drawing the short straw for some reason.
But again, it's another exemplification of what this is all about, from my view, is imbalances of power and the ability of people to exploit their positions, because there is such a big disparity between the positions. And I hope that, I said this last time, I just hope that in the end the focus isn't on that this kind of media spotlight at the moment doesn't get distracted into perhaps the kind of issue which appeals to the media, in other words personalities and whatever, where it's much more of a general issue affecting people not just in Hollywood or even in aid agencies, but people in a domestic setting, etc.
Absolutely. I think it'd be a very sad day if people stopped funding Oxfam for the incredible work that they do, or Save the Children. That's not what we should do. As I said, this is something that should be investigated, and the people who've engaged in it should be prosecuted. It's not a case of, oh well, let's stop giving them money. As you said, this is happening. The Me Too movement, the huge Me Too movement, is showing that this is happening in every industry, in every country. So no, the solution isn't let's stop funding them at all. It's let's put some processes into place to protect vulnerable people, and particularly vulnerable women. Yeah,
but also, I mean, but this kind of thing is going on when there are, the human trafficking, and that again is, you would say, kind of gender neutral, although again there's obviously gender neutral to the extent that there are people being exploited in terms of their labour, whether they're male or female. Maybe the forms of exploitation are different. What's good about this, Simon never disagrees with me, which is great. This is this is a sign of the culture of the management school is far more far more open.
I'm not blaming the management school. This is just me. I just disagree.
Well, go on, because we've got about half a second left.
Oh, just
no. I don't know. 5 minutes left. 5 seconds left.
Exploitation is a gendered issue. There's no doubt about
it. But I was saying that the exploitation takes place in relation to both men and to women.
Yeah.
It may take different.
But yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of objectifying women, in terms of the horrific physical aspect of it that men don't go through as much, definitely. from that point of view, women are being more exploited.
But there's never been, again, the media...
And children.
Yeah, well, quite, yeah. But the media interest in the scandals concerning Oxfam is far greater than the media interest in human trafficking. I mean, our present Prime Minister is particularly exercised by human trafficking from the time as Home Secretary, and she talks about it quite a lot, but the media never shows the slightest... It's an invisible scandal.
It's because the government is funding Oxfam. It's because we are funding Oxfam. So it's sort of, well, do we have an indirect hand in this? So that's something very different from all the horrible trafficking that's taking place by a group of bad people. You know, this is the reason why we're all engaging in this. It's because anybody who donates, whether it's £1 or £1 million, feels like, goodness, I have an obligation to either stop funding this or make sure that this is being dealt with properly.
Yeah. But again, so we're kind of in amongst all of this. We've got all these inequalities of power, and the media itself, of course, because the media has such incredible power, which it abuses. So you know, you've got we're dependent on a kind of an institution which itself reflects power imbalances to tell us about the power imbalances that exist in the world, and they obviously can't possibly do it in a way which is defensible. Yeah, and so in terms of, well, thank you very much for all that. And two disagreements, but I mean, obviously, I'm not going to ask you very much about Brexit. Just say, you know, if Simon was here, I'd probably chunter on a little bit about that. 62 MPs have written to Theresa May saying that we want to cut off all our ties with Europe, and the harder the Brexit, the better. And this is why I just find this so woefully predictable, because it just shows, I suppose, the impossibility of the Prime Minister having any kind of a coherent policy, because the faction fighting within her party is just so, has become, well, I mean, the divisions within that party are sharper than they've ever been.
Yeah.
And I would almost say sharper than they've ever been within any major political party in Britain, in British history. So, and again, the letter from the MPs suggests that we should be much more aggressive in our negotiating stance towards the European Union. The implication being that we are really equal in this negotiating situation, forgetting that there are 27 other countries on one side and a market which dwarfs Britain. There's always this kind of, because the Eurosceptics think in terms of the nation state, they can't think of the EU in any other terms, so they're thinking that really we are equal to any of these people. We can take them on a level playing field, and
it's ridiculous.
Distorted view of reality.
It's a very sad day for universities, I would say, when we talk about this. It's a very sad day. I think we are engaging in incredible research with other universities across the European Union. We have funding that we share with them, Horizon 2020 and so on, and various others. Our Erasmus exchange programs. I mean, it's just a very, very sad day for universities, apart from everything else, which we don't have any time to go into. But I think that we are really robbing our future generations of a great opportunity. Right.
Well, I'm glad you're sitting on the fence, as Simon and I do. We always say we have no views at all on Brexit. But, I mean, what the thing that was really the most astonishing was Theresa May's speech a few days ago, when she talked about the possibility of security relations within Europe being dislocated by this. And I think what she was trying to do was to say that the EU is so irresponsible that in its negotiating tactics it will even use security as a weapon to force Britain to come to terms on other areas. It's just crazy. The idea that the European states or the EU would be wanting to play that kind of dangerous game, it's just idiotic. But anyway, I think we've run out of time, and It's been absolutely, well, it's been invigorating, we're very, very grateful to...
Thank you for having me.
Sophie,
It's been a pleasure.
No, and various noises off camera have been made, coughing and various splutterings, but none at all so you've set the bar high for us. So thank you to everyone, and tune in and like us, or whatever, and don't express neutral opinions. And thanks so much again, Sophie Alcaled from the distant wastes of the management school, for coming in, filling in admirably for Dr. Mabon.